Hi, everybody. My name is Arnie Alpert. I've had the pleasure and the honor of knowing Don Booth as a neighbor, as a friend, as a building contractor, as someone I've gotten arrested with and gone to court with. Actually, there was one situation where we were in Superior Court. I was representing myself, and Don had an attorney, and the attorney introduced a motion to have our cases separated because he said we don't know what Mr. Alpert might do in the courtroom anyway. And that's where we were. In the end, the judge ruled that there was this thing called the First Amendment that said that we have a right to freedom of speech and free assembly and the right to petition our government for redress of grievances. Imagine that. I think we need to be doing some more of those things. Don, you've heard about the greatest generation, the men who lived through the Great Depression and went off to fight in World War II. Well, Don Booth reveals another side of the greatest generation, and these were men who were conscientiously opposed to war and actually refused to fight. For Don, many of the COs came from the traditional peace churches, the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Church of the Brethren, and others came from a smattering of other faiths and odd little sects and stuff. Don didn't really come from that type of background, but he was a deeply idealistic young man, he was a deeply introspective young man, and when he was faced with the draft, he tried to figure out what to do. He was living in Boston at the time, and I think there was a lot of discussion going on. In his journal, Don wrote, "In selective service draft this fall, my order number locally was 116, which means a fairly early call to service. But I filed conscientious objection papers so the service may not be in the Army. I don't want to go along with the crowd. I'd like the Army's physical training and relief from personal responsibility, and I'd be an American citizen on my discharge." Don was actually born in Canada. "But I think I'd rather not kill or be killed, and would rather direct my energies to constructive work rather than destructive. I've seen too much of the present turning of energies, both national and personal, to killing, and I don't think the waste is justified. The best should stay behind. They should have the courage to save themselves, to clean up afterwards. I don't know that I'm the best, but I'm better than some. Or rather, my energies directed to the improvement and constructive service are of more service to the world than are the energies of a better man directed merely to operating a bombing plane." Well, Don was drafted into CPS, and the 12 million people who were drafted, 12,000 or 1/10 of 1% ended up in something called the Civilian Public Service, which was a creation of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, and together with agencies of the other peace churches. And the idea was that these men who were conscientious objectors would do something useful during the war. Well, this was an awkward negotiation with the Selective Service and the Army and the White House to figure out what this was going to be. And what was supposed to be by law work of national importance kind of ended up being, let's get these guys out of the way as much as possible. Although some of them did go and do work on dairy farms because the labor was gone, and they did work in mental hospitals. But a lot of them were in logging camps and doing other type of work just out of the way of public view. But imagine all these young men, idealistic, independent, willing to stick out from the crowd, from a wide variety of religious and philosophical beliefs, different social backgrounds, but all of them with an aversion to war and violence. General Hershey, who was the head of Selective Service, said they are a most peculiar kind of people. Don's neighbor, Dave Curtis, lent me a book. I confess to you, I forgot to return it to him. It's called Peace Was in Their Hearts. It was written by a fellow named Richard Anderson, who was a CO, a CPS veteran, and he surveyed as many of these guys as he could find, and actually ended up getting 1,000 people writing back to him. And one of the things that he wrote was, he said, many spoke about a persistence in what they did, whether it was in demanding high standards of themselves, being straightforward and open in business dealings, or refusing to compromise moral and ethical beliefs, perhaps also a little perfectionism. Well, they got sent off together, and this Richard Anderson describes an unfamiliar luxury of being with so many like-minded people. So imagine what it must have been like for Don Booth to find himself in the company of so many other idealistic, independent, peculiar people. throughout the duration of the war. Here's something else Don wrote in his journal or in one of his letters about what it was like doing work of national importance for the CPS. He said, using pick and shovel gets pretty wearisome, especially when we hear that the holes aren't considered important. For we think we know better ways of occupying our time. Some men have gone off to jail, by the way, in protest. But we like working together and can discuss history or psychology or ethics of camp problems and still keep the pick swinging. And most of the men are happily working hard, enjoying the discipline in their second mild demonstration of sincerity, and consider this good preparation for later, greater service. Me, I also like being required, morally if not actually, to do hard physical work, for I haven't done much before. Well, these young men built a community, and during and after the war, they found a group of women with compatible views. Well, they debated and discussed, including discussing how to apply nonviolence to all of the world's evils, and whether the CPS itself represented an unnecessary compromise with the war system. Some COs, not Don, but some COs actually walked out of the camps and ended up in federal prison. But they also met people. People came through these camps to give presentations or just visit. And Don got to meet along the course of the way people like A.J. Musty. He met Bayard Rustin, who stopped through one of his camps. Bayard had already been arrested for acts of civil disobedience against racial discrimination and would go on to advise Dr. King and organize the March on Washington. In 1963, Don was there at the March on Washington in the crowd. But when the war ended, the idealism of these young men, if you could just imagine it, it got released into the world. And the movements of the post-war period for peace, movements for civil rights, movement for reform of the mental health system were built on their insights, their labor, and their idealism. Experiments in community living, alternative education models, the use of civil disobedience to protest war and segregation, all flowed from this other finest generation of young men and the women that they were with. Don wrote, "The ideals which brought me into CPS are deeper and broader than they were 4 years ago when he had gone into the CPS." So that for Don, it was a natural path to community builders, to solar houses, to peace vigils, war tax resistance, arrest protesting war at the offices of senators and at the factories of weapons makers. When he was young and other young men went off to war, Don Booth went off to peace, and he never came back. One of the songs that the men in the CPS liked to sing was called "Down in My Heart," and you will find it in the program. We can sing along, especially if someone is here to lead it, aren't you?